In an exciting match between MagnusCarlsen and Hikaru, we see the opening moves of the Sicilian defense, a popular choice for black to challenge white's central control. MagnusCarlsen launches the pawn from e2 to e4, staking a claim in the center right off the bat. This is a classic opening move, setting the stage for dynamic play. Hikaru responds with a pawn from c7 to c5, embracing the Sicilian defense. This move aims to contest white's control over the center and promises a complex game. White, MagnusCarlsen, brings out the knight from g1 to f3, developing a piece and eyeing the center, a solid move to continue building his position. Black, Hikaru, pushes a pawn from d7 to d6, fortifying his central structure and preparing for further development. The game is heating up with both players setting their strategies. MagnusCarlsen surprises with the bishop from f1 to b5, and check. This unexpected move puts pressure on black's position early on. Hikaru defends with the bishop from c8 to d7, blocking the check and keeping the game balanced. The tension is palpable as both players maneuver for advantage. MagnusCarlsen captures with the bishop from b5 to d7, and check. This exchange intensifies the battle in the center of the board. Hikaru captures back with the knight from b8 to d7. The early exchange of pieces opens up the game, setting the stage for a tactical showdown. White, MagnusCarlsen, castles kingside, moving the king from e1 to g1 and the rook from h1 to f1. A smart move to safeguard the king and connect the rooks. Black, Hikaru, develops the knight from g8 to f6, aiming at the center and preparing for potential attacks. The game is shaping up to be a thrilling contest. MagnusCarlsen presses forward with a pawn from d2 to d3, supporting his central control and preparing for further development. Hikaru counters with a pawn from e7 to e6, bolstering his defenses and eyeing potential pawn breaks. The strategic dance continues. White, MagnusCarlsen, strikes with a knight from f3 to g5, threatening the f7 pawn and adding pressure to black's position. Hikaru responds by developing the bishop from f8 to e7, defending the f7 pawn and keeping his position intact. The game remains tense. MagnusCarlsen pushes a pawn from f2 to f4, aiming to control more space and open lines for his pieces. A bold move in the center. Black, Hikaru, castles kingside, moving the king from e8 to g8 and the rook from h8 to f8, a safe move to secure the king's position. White, MagnusCarlsen, advances a pawn from c2 to c4, further challenging black's central control and aiming for a pawn chain. Hikaru retreats the knight from d7 to b8, perhaps planning a different route for this piece. The game's complexity deepens. MagnusCarlsen develops the knight from b1 to c3, adding to his central influence and preparing for potential attacks. Hikaru moves the knight from b8 to c6, eyeing the center and setting up for tactical possibilities. The battle for the center continues. White, MagnusCarlsen, develops the bishop from c1 to e3, aiming at the d4 square and adding pressure to black's position. Hikaru strikes back with a pawn from d6 to d5, challenging white's central pawns and opening lines for his pieces. MagnusCarlsen retreats the bishop from e3 to f2, perhaps preparing for a different strategy. A bolder knight leap to c6 could have tightened the grip. Hikaru pushes a pawn from h7 to h6, possibly to prevent any knight jumps to g5. The game remains closely contested. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the knight from g5 back to f3, adjusting his piece placement and keeping the pressure on. Hikaru captures with the pawn from d5 to e4. This move aims to break white's pawn structure and gain a strategic advantage. The game is heating up with this bold move. MagnusCarlsen recaptures with the pawn from d3 to e4, maintaining his pawn structure and keeping the game balanced. Hikaru pushes a pawn from e6 to e5, challenging white's central control and opening lines for his pieces. The tension in the center is palpable. White, MagnusCarlsen, advances a pawn from f4 to f5, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses. Hikaru moves the rook from f8 to e8, connecting his rooks and preparing for potential action along the e-file. The game's intensity grows. MagnusCarlsen moves the rook from f1 to e1, adding pressure to the e-file and preparing for potential attacks. A bolder knight leap to c6 could have tightened the grip. Hikaru strikes with the knight from c6 to d4, challenging white's central control and aiming for a tactical advantage. The game's complexity deepens. White, MagnusCarlsen, captures with the knight from f3 to e5, taking a central pawn and gaining material. This move shifts the momentum in his favor. Hikaru responds by moving the bishop from e7 to d6, attacking the knight and maintaining pressure. A bolder move to f3 might have been even more aggressive. MagnusCarlsen retreats the knight from e5 to f3, adjusting his piece placement and keeping the pressure on. Hikaru moves the knight from f6 to g4, threatening the f2 bishop and adding to the tactical tension. The game is filled with threats and counter-threats. White, MagnusCarlsen, pushes a pawn from h2 to h3, attacking the knight on g4 and preparing to capture it. Hikaru captures with the knight from g4 to f2, taking the bishop and gaining material. This bold move shifts the game's dynamics significantly. The knight's sacrifice has opened up white's king. MagnusCarlsen recaptures with the king from g1 to f2, defending the bishop and keeping the game balanced. The king's move to the center adds to the tension. Hikaru develops the queen from d8 to b6, attacking the b2 pawn and adding pressure to white's position. The game remains closely contested. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves a pawn from b2 to b3, defending the c4 pawn and preparing for potential attacks. A bolder pawn push to a6 could have been an interesting choice. Hikaru captures with the knight from d4 to f3, taking the knight and gaining material. This move shifts the momentum in his favor. The knight's capture has opened lines for black's pieces. MagnusCarlsen recaptures with the queen from d1 to f3, defending the knight and keeping the game balanced. The queen's move adds to the tactical complexity. Hikaru moves the bishop from d6 to e5, attacking the queen and maintaining pressure. The game remains tense with both players seeking advantage. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the knight from c3 to d5, challenging black's central control and preparing for potential attacks. Hikaru moves the queen from b6 to a5, attacking the b2 pawn and adding pressure to white's position. The game's complexity deepens. MagnusCarlsen moves the rook from a1 to d1, connecting his rooks and preparing for potential action along the d-file. Hikaru captures with the queen from a5 to a2 and check. This move aims to gain material and disrupt white's position. The queen's capture has thrown a wrench into white's plans. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the rook from e1 to e2, blocking the check and defending the king. A bolder queen move to e2 could have been a game changer. Hikaru retreats the queen from a2 to a5, maintaining pressure and keeping the game balanced. The game remains closely contested. MagnusCarlsen pushes a pawn from f5 to f6, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses. Hikaru moves the rook from e8 to e6, defending the f6 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay. The game's intensity grows. White, MagnusCarlsen, captures with the pawn from f6 to g7, aiming to create a passed pawn and increase pressure. This move shifts the momentum in his favor. Hikaru moves the rook from a8 to e8, connecting his rooks and preparing for potential action along the e-file. The game's complexity deepens. MagnusCarlsen moves the king from f2 to g1, adjusting his king's position and preparing for potential attacks. Hikaru moves the rook from e6 to g6, attacking the g7 pawn and adding pressure to white's position. The game remains tense with both players seeking advantage. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the rook from d1 to f1, preparing for potential action along the f-file. A bolder rook move to g6 could have been more aggressive. Hikaru captures with the rook from g6 to g7, taking the pawn and gaining material. This move shifts the momentum in his favor. The rook's capture has opened up white's king even more. MagnusCarlsen moves the king from g1 to h1, adjusting his king's position and preparing for potential attacks. Hikaru moves the queen from a5 to d8, attacking the e4 pawn and adding pressure to white's position. The game remains closely contested. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the queen from f3 to e3, defending the e4 pawn and keeping the game balanced. Hikaru moves the queen from d8 to d6, attacking the e5 bishop and maintaining pressure. The game's complexity deepens. MagnusCarlsen moves the rook from f1 to f5, attacking the f7 pawn and adding pressure to black's position. Hikaru moves the queen from d6 to g6, attacking the f5 rook and maintaining pressure. The game remains tense with both players seeking advantage. White, MagnusCarlsen, moves the queen from e3 to f3, defending the f5 rook and keeping the game balanced. A bolder queen move to g3 could have been a game changer. Hikaru moves the rook from e8 to e6, defending the f6 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay. The game's intensity grows. MagnusCarlsen moves the rook from e2 to d2, adjusting his piece placement and keeping the pressure on. A bolder rook move to g3 could have been more aggressive. Hikaru moves the king from g8 to h7, adjusting his king's position and preparing for potential attacks. A bolder pawn push to g4 might have been even more aggressive. White, MagnusCarlsen captures with the rook from f5 to e5, taking the bishop and gaining material. This move shifts the momentum decisively in his favor. With this capture, Carlsen's strategy has paid off brilliantly, leading to Hikaru's resignation. MagnusCarlsen emerges victorious, showcasing his mastery over the board. And with that final move, MagnusCarlsen secures the victory as Hikaru resigns. A masterful display of strategy and tactics, leading to a well-deserved win for Carlsen.